I'm glad I left to learn.
We have a few folks who can't be here today who wanted to be here. Barb and Terry Eisenberg are sick. Received word late yesterday that John Coffey, who just joined the church, Pat's husband, died yesterday afternoon and in Roanoke. And so she and Charles won't be able to be here, and they wanted to be here. And some of you may want to go back and look at this again later. So we're going to record this and update. I'll email out a link to the YouTube where you can find it if you want to dip in on the conversation again. It's not quite 11, so we'll give a few minutes for the people to be here. Heather is here this morning. She's at work, so she's like, I can't even turn on my camera because of HIPAA stuff. I can't talk, but I want to listen in. So she's here just sort of listening in, and because she's curious and interested, and I'm glad for it.
And Judy will be a little bit late.
Okay, that's fine.
She'll be just a few minutes later.
Morning, Barb.
So we're gonna need to, these microphones, make sure that they're all the way down this long table. So, and if you're gonna speak in, particularly since we're recording this, make sure you get near one. We'll move them around as we need to. If you folks on Zoom can't hear somebody, speak up, let us know. And if you want to chime in some way, let us know too.
I think they need to go down
There.
Hi Debbie, hi Larry. I had to.
Hi. How you doing?
Hi there. Oh, hi Ann.
I just hurt so much.
Hi
there.
What?
So
Ann. She's on the Zoom. Back to that. Everything else. Okay. See some suspicious dots on. Yeah, it's very good. Just a little bit.
I usually raise cake will take care of me.
Yes.
Rice cake. And if it does turn out that he has, some cancer, I would like to treat him. I really put him through that. He's too old. Chocolate's my favorite. I did that once.
Let's see, Larry and Debbie, good to see you guys.
Good to see y'all.
And welcome, Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you.
I had a problem with it.
Especially because it's the Zoom from home.
All right, while we're getting organized, maybe waiting for one or two more people to show up, let me just ask. I had some people who said they could not find the reading, even find it in the email. We had one person who didn't get the email at all. So, and then some people couldn't. How many of you were able to access and download the reading, even if you didn't get it all read?
Yes.
The
I
reading
wasn't
was
able
almost
to.
already.
You didn't find the reading at all?
I found it.
Yes.
But when I was trying to read it,
Yeah.
there was no page up, page down. It just kept popping all over the place.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right.
So,
All right, let me think about that. And then the video, I had one person say they kept getting asked to give credit card information.
Yeah,
Well,
but I
that's if
went to
you hit the
YouTube
other
and got
side.
What's that?
When you go to watch it, if you hit the other side, watch now, that sends you to the credit card.
Oh,
If you just click on the actual picture of the video, it just plays.
Are you kidding?
yeah, that's,
it was really small.
I did not intend to send you something that had to be
Yeah, 'cause it was
paid
$1
for.
for 24 hours.
Well, they said it was free.
And then
Right.
after that, it was.
Yeah, when I went to
$6
the page I sent you, you should just be able to click play on the
And I
video
only
itself and it should just play.
Part of it
Mine
this
did.
morning.
Yeah.
It gave an option to subscribe on ours, but it didn't charge us anything. It just said that.
All right,
I
so,
just went to YouTube and looked up that.
and you found it there on
I found
YouTube.
it.
Okay, so I'll try to do that too. I did not intend for anybody to have to pay anything or use a credit card or whatever. That was, when I found it, it just played. So sorry if that was confusing. I didn't, if there's gonna be something you have to pay for, I'll let you know that and you'll have the option to pay for it yourself, but I'll also buy one through the church and we'll have a couple of times here where you can come and watch it together with people. So we don't all have to buy something. So sorry, some of that was confusing when you do things like this. Everybody's computer operates a little bit differently, and so I know some folks watched the movie. Some folks read some of the readings. Some folks didn't have an opportunity to do any of that. And so we'll just be mindful of that as we have conversations, as we get started. We're at different places and levels of understanding. But as we should always do when we gather together, whether it is to do the business of the church or to learn together, we'll begin with prayer this morning. So let us pray. God, as we gather this morning, we are aware that this conflict that we are looking at has been going on for decades, but right now is one of the really bad chapters in the midst of all this. We're aware that your children on all sides of this conflict are hurting this day. And so we pray for your spirit, for your peace. And we pray that you send your spirit of wisdom and understanding upon us as we seek to become better informed and learn how we might be helpful as peacemakers, even from a distance. As we gather this morning, we lift up in prayer those who would like to be here but who cannot. In particular, Barb and Terry Eisenberg, who are sick, and Pat Coffey, who is making plans for the funeral of her husband John, who died yesterday. We lift them up in prayer this morning. Again, guide our conversations this morning. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So if you watched the video and you read these 3 chapters, you have a lot of information to sort through. And so I'm just going to begin there, not with trying to explain any of this to you, but I just want to ask the opening question. What in what you read was surprising to you? What was new information to you?
The Palestinian narrative, that entire thing.
The entire thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with that. I think it was just like you said, if you are, if you hear one side of a story, you believe it. And then the next time you hear the next story or the other side, then you see what's really happened, so it was it brought some reality to that situation.
Okay. And that's one of, this book, which I found by Frederick Martin, A Plea for Tough Love. He is a retired minister in the Evangelical Free Church in Minnesota, a Midwesterner. He is somebody who would read scripture in quite a different way than I and most Presbyterians would, but who became disturbed after making some trips to the Holy Land himself, and only ever having interactions with one side of the conflict and only ever hearing one side of the story. And so he wanted to set about to, as he says in the introduction, page 19, deliberately set out in as strong and convincing a manner as possible both the Israeli and the Palestinian narratives, so that both can be heard and considered. And I will say it's one of the rare texts where somebody is setting out to do that, and I think has been able to hold themselves to it. That looking for information on this conflict almost always leads you strongly biased on one side or the other, and so this was a good place to start, I thought, just to get some background. And I was grateful Kathleen had a chance to read through it yesterday with her historical background, and she agreed both this and the BBC documentary were good sources of sort of laying out just a framework of what happened, when, who did it, and there are a number of things that we'll have to keep sort of in mind. I printed out some maps for you this morning because we have heard a lot of these names of places on the news over the years, but knowing exactly where they are, where the cities are, who lived there, when, what the geography is, all of that is not necessarily something we've all had a deep dive and introduction to. Other things that were new and surprising in the reading of the documentary.
Tony,
Yeah.
George just texted me and said, send me the link. But I don't know if he'll do it or not.
Okay.
I tried to talk him
I
into
think
it.
the beginning of some of the history that tells how the land was divided up are the same problems that or in Iraq and other places in the Far East, the Middle East, I should say, with the United Kingdom dividing up things. I won't say helter-skelter, but mostly in a way that was incorrect, but different for the people that actually populated the area. That
Yes.
caused conflict there, conflict here, just in the way it was divided up.
What's his email?
He has a weird one. It's called, it's Sonny Davis. Don't ask me why.
SUNN
SONNI.
SONNI.
Let me find it again. 1015 @yahoo.com.
SONNI 101.
Sonny Davis,
So SONNIDAVIS
1015,
1015
yeah, @Yahoo.
at Yahoo.
And it says Lewis Brown for who it's to. He is
Okay.
weird, isn't he? You know, he was doing
Okay.
some ordering and things got screwed up and
Xi Jinping, which the president called constructive and productive. The two leaders reached agreements on military communications, no trafficking, and artificial intelligence. But the president said, "Get no illusions. There is a lot of work ahead." I trust to verify.
The schools there, but okay. Can I build on something that Ed said? I think that was Ed's voice I recognize.
Yeah.
The whole area of Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, all was part of the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled that area for decades. After the Ottomans were on the losing side of World War I, and the French and the English took over, and much like they had done, that whole area had been under colonial control basically for decades. So, you know, when I sent the note to Tony that, you know, when you have the war and they talk about the Syria coming in and Jordan coming in and Transjordan, those were new countries, and they were not countries that had anything. They were arbitrary lines that the British and the French created. I don't know if you remember when the Gulf War broke out, Kuwait, which is that funny little place that we fought that war over, supposedly, that was a present from the British to a specific family because of their support during World War I. That's the only reason Kuwait exists. There's no other reason for it. So this idea of a nation state, in many ways, the fact that the Jews returned or they were there and had religion to tie them together, they are closer to being a nation state, a country, a community than the rest of the whole Middle East. And one of the ways you create a nationhood is to have a common enemy. And that's one of the things we're going to have to deal with on top of everything else between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Thanks, Kathleen. Can you see the map that I put up? Is that showing up for you?
Great map.
Yeah, so this is sort of showing essentially how the British and the French decided that they would divide up this part of the world as World War I was ending. So the date of this is 1916. The war is still going on, and they're already beginning to divide up the so-called spoils of war from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so there is a part of this conflict isn't just about Jews and Arabs or Israelis and Palestinians. It's also part of the lingering legacy of Western European colonialism and the impacts of that upon other peoples.
Well, the British, all during their time of influence in this area, did all kinds of promising
Yes.
to all of the factors involved here. And their goal, of course, was to get the support of the local, not the typical peasant, but the people of power in these areas, which in most cases were called effendi. And so they really did move as the wind blew them, depending on what influence it would give them. And because they did have help from the people in the region in World War I, they figured if they kept moving along the same way, they'd be great. Well, then World War II comes along and changes the entire apple cart. Because now they have to start wooing the Arabs again, who aligned with Hitler in Germany. So it's really difficult to track some of the happenings there if you don't know about all these different things that were going on. And the British like to think that they were, on the playing fields of Eton. And the people in power, whether it be in Palestine or in what is today Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all of them, they were looking to fill their own coffers. And that's what it came down to. It was basically, how much can I benefit from this and what should I do to get that benefit?
So, and in fairness, as World War I ended, there were a number of ethnic groups that did realize their own new political nation states as part of the way that the peace of World War I was drawn up. So perhaps the one we're most familiar with is Greece. And that which had been part of an empire was now recognized as a nation. There were others, and what part of what the British had promised to Arabs in this region is that they would get one of those nation states. They said that around 1916, and then the British foreign minister in 1917 issues the Balfour Declaration, which you would have read about and you're reading and heard about in the video, which was this sense that now the British government was going to support the creation of a Jewish state in their historical homeland, and there are lots of problems with that. It sort of promised that this would not affect the rights or the status of any of the people already living there, and it made promises that were just impossible, partially because it was one nation promising to a group of people who were not yet a nation that they could have a nation in a place where people already lived. And that is part of the seeds of this conflict. Other things that really surprised people in what we read.
One of the things that upset me was towards the end, like the people that are living, I thought, well, maybe it's just Jewish people that were living in Israel, and that's not the case. There's Palestinian people, but there's like people that live there that they have to keep doing lawsuits in order to keep the administration out, or the military out of their homeland. And that really upset me. I thought, they've lived there for ages. Why can't they live there in peace? And you know what? The United States had the same problems with the Indians and the
That's what I was thinking about.
and other nationalities.
Yeah, certainly there are some pretty disturbing parallels between the experience of Palestinians in post-World War II and the experience of Native Americans during the time of American expansion, settlement, the colonial period and beyond. And that it continues. So, in recent years, when we have discovered that, it would be really nice to send a pipeline through lands that we have given by treaty to Native Americans as reservations, we have used the full force and power of our government and courts to insist that we be allowed to run pipelines underneath their water supplies, disturb their ceremonial gravelands for things like that. Much in the same way, what the current situation in so at this point, the Gaza Strip, where the fighting is right now, is sort of an entirely different situation than the West Bank. And but on the West Bank, this process of demolishing homes, of denying people access to their lands and declaring the lands vacant and abandoned, and demolishing homes to make room for more Jewish settlers, and to continue to concentrate the Palestinian population in smaller and smaller geographic areas. And the part that I need to explore more and hope that we will is this notion that he talks about, that you're being a citizen of Israel is not that we don't they don't think about that the same way that we think about that in terms of rights and access. And if you are not a Jewish citizen, you do not have the same rights. If you are a non-Jewish citizen even of the state of Israel, you have different rights and whole different scheme of ways that you have access to even things like obtaining building permits, or making use of land, or being able to move and live in a community. So for the benefit of those who didn't get a chance to do a lot of this, you hear sort of what was surprising. Let's just try to walk through the chapters from Martin. So he wants to take us back. He begins with the Israeli narrative here, and a lot of this, he says, will probably be pretty familiar to Americans in the way that we've heard the story of this conflict. It goes back to the late 19th century. There were Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia who were already beginning to move back to this ancient homeland of the Jews in response to persecution. So late 19th century, we're talking 1870s, 1880s, right? Here in this country, we're just sort of repairing the country from the Civil War, and not paying a whole lot of attention at that time to what's going on over in Europe. So in 1882, the records can indicate there were about 24,000 Jews living in Palestine. On page 19, there's a chart that tracks 5 waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine, which over 60 years increased that population of Jews living there by a factor of 10, from 25,000 to 250,000, 250,000. Martin marks the start of the Zionist movement, and we'll talk about that term some more as we move along. But the Zionist movement, which in its simplest iteration is a desire to rebuild a Jewish homeland in Zion, centered around Jerusalem, but the historical homeland of the Jews, understand as the land of promise, going back to Abraham and post Moses and crossing the Jordan, all of that. He marks the start of that movement as a recognizable movement, not just a desire in some individuals' hearts and spirits, but as a formal movement to 1896.
I have one question.
Yeah.
How did the Jewish people lose their land for this long of a period of time?
Sure. So that there's probably 100 stories around that, but one thing to know is that sort of late in the 1st century, there was a Jewish revolt. So after the death of Jesus in about the year 70, there was a Jewish revolt within Jerusalem against the Romans, which was put down pretty brutally by the Romans, failed to throw off Roman occupation. That is when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed for the 2nd time as part of the Roman response. And of course, if you have an empire as large as the Romans did, and you have people that are going to rebel, what is the response of the empire going to be after you crush the rebellion? Well, I mean, some people are going to die in the midst of it, but we're mainly just going to pack you up and send you other places, and we'll bring other people in here. If this land is something you want to fight us for, we're just going to scatter you. So that's a part of the story, and so really. They were living under occupation then. 70 is an important year. There were no doubt other major historical waves of migration, but even with Paul in the 1st century, you see him traveling around, right, the Mediterranean, and going to various cities in the Roman Empire outside of Palestine, and meeting first with Jewish communities that have already begun to spread out there, partly for economic opportunity. Other questions and things so far? Okay. So from 1896, Theodore Herzl is saying that there is such anti-Semitism in Europe that there is no way, and this is in 1896, right? We're not to World War II yet. We're not. There's already such sporadic instances of violence and persecution that the only way for us to have safety is if we have our own homeland. And at that point, he wasn't even necessarily insisting that it be in Palestine, but we need some place. We need some place with borders marked on a map where Jews can go and live as Jews and not have to assimilate within, but still be held as other within other places. And Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, even in the 1890s, were the most enthusiastic in their response to this budding Zionist movement. And a lot of that has to do, and we're going to start, we're going to do our own Bible study in 2 weeks. And then after that, we're going to look at some ways of reading those same Bible passages that we've looked at from other lenses and other schools of theological thought, and see where some of this comes from. But a lot of it is connected to end times, the second coming, the sense of reading biblical prophecy as a map to the future. And so the idea that if we can reestablish Jews in Palestine, that will be something that will really get the end times started, be a trigger to help bring Jesus riding in on that white horse and the rapture and all of that business. And then in 19, yes.
Can I interrupt? I thought I heard Lynn Haynes' voice there, and she can probably add to this. What people may not realize is that the anti-Semitism went way back in Europe. Right. In the Middle Ages, Jews couldn't own property, and they were still. I mean, you might remember the Catholic Church did not say until the 1960s that Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus. So that was the teaching of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. They were blamed for the plague because they didn't get it, because they were cleaner than everybody else. One of the few things they could get involved with was banking. And because Jewish communities were tied to each other, they became the first bankers, because Christians supposedly couldn't charge interest. And who liked your banker? And so that there were several times that kings would say, I need money, and the bankers wouldn't loan the money because things were bad, and so they would confiscate all Jewish possessions and kick everybody who was Jewish out of the country. So there's this long history in Europe of anti-Semitism, and they were literally kicked out of countries and had to move from place to place. So it's really, you can really sort of understand why at some point somebody says, we need a place of our own. We need some place where we can be safe. And so that's what you're coming to at the end of the 1800s.
Particularly in the Slavic countries, in Eastern Europe, the treatment of Jews was very brutal. One of the things that happened on a regular basis, and yes, Kathleen, it is Lynn.
Yeah.
One of the things that happened on a regular basis was whenever anything went wrong, whether it be Poland or Russia or the Ukraine or what was then called White Russia, anything that happened that went wrong, they needed a scapegoat, and a scapegoat were the Jews, because there were all these superstitions, there were all these ideas that people had, that they were defiling young women, Christian women, and sacrificing them to, their crazy God, and all kinds of things. They could not ride on a camel or a horse because that would put their heads higher than a Christian's who was walking down the street. It was not a very good situation for Jews to live anywhere. But the reaction in anything that went wrong was a pogrom, which was where the Jews would hear the yelling and the screaming coming. And the next thing you know, all of the locals were appearing with their pitchforks and swords and any other weapons, and blaming the Jews for, it could have been bad harvest, it could have been anything. And there was, you know, a lot of torture and death. And the Jews wanted to go somewhere else because they knew every time they heard that yelling that they were going to wind up with people being killed. It was the common thing, and it happened over and over and over again. So there's no surprise that the Jews wanted to go someplace else. The problem was that nobody would take them, which we all know happened in World War II as well. Nobody wanted them. They wanted to go someplace where they could live their lives and carry on their traditions and not have to constantly be afraid or fear they would have to fight for their lives.
Thanks.
And also think most of the Jews at that point were what we would consider to be Orthodox. So they looked different. They all knew Hebrew. Their services were in Hebrew. Well, that's a little strange. So they were different. They didn't eat pork in an area of the world where everybody ate pork. So they were the other. And it's really easy, we can see it today with all sorts of groups, of saying, well, they're the bad guys because they're different. They're not like us.
And it's helpful that concept of collective punishment is something that we'll go ahead and put a pin on here. The idea that something happens, and even if it was perhaps one member of the community, you punish the whole community for that. That's a little bit beyond a bad harvest, but you know, if you have one Jew who steals, you round up and push out all the Jew. Collective punishment is a feature of this as well. And actually, one of the points the video made is some of the first Jewish immigrants back to Palestine were not the Orthodox Jews, but were secular Jews, pretty committed atheistic Jews and socialists in their mindset. And so that's another feature of this. In 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, the salient part of that text, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I think that's one long sentence that promises a whole lot. Jewish homeland in Palestine won't affect any of the rights of the people already living there, and won't affect any of the rights of Jews living any place else in the world. Just sort of the sheer hubris and arrogance of one man in the British government making that kind of promise, which did do a whole lot of motivating, particularly in the Zionist movement. That declaration was printed in the Times of London 2 weeks after he sent it, and 5 weeks after he sent that, the British Army captured Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire. So it came at a time when the wheels of history were turning. World War I ends. We have the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and so it's worth noting, according to the U.S. Department of State, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Germany were all formally excluded from the Paris Peace Conference, from being at the table to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles that formally ended World War I. So who did that leave sitting at the table?
British.
The British,
And the French.
the French,
Us.
and us,
Yeah.
and some other minor players, but really it was a three-way conversation to figure out how we were going to redesign the map and reapportion control of a large segment of the world in the aftermath of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson went to Paris, spent 6 months in Paris. I'm probably going to butcher the name. It looks like George's to me. So in French, that's who does French. Clemenceau. Clemenceau was the French prime minister, and the British prime minister was the other big one. Wilson went to Paris. Anybody remember this from a US history class with a plan that had some points to it? How many points were there? 14, the 14 points, right? In the end, how many of those points did Woodrow Wilson get incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles?
One.
One, he got one, and it was watered down. Anybody, and Kathleen, I know remembers what the one is, you probably do too. It was the creation of the League of Nations,
Yeah.
right? But Wilson went there.
We did not join.
That's right, which
Right.
we did not join, and we didn't let Germany join either. And so Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference wanting to, I mean, there are all kinds of things in his points. But the major thrust of it was to try to achieve a peace, now that this war to end all wars, as they called it then, was over, that would not cede, right, cede the field for yet another another conflict. And so his phrase was peace without victory. That the fighting was done, now we need to find a peace, and we don't need to, we who won the war don't need to sort of pin all the blame on our enemies, punish the enemy anymore. We need to try to put the world together in a way that's going to be more peaceful. Clemenceau, whose country had been devastated in many ways by the Germans in World War I, he wanted the Germans to pay, and to pay big time for having, in his opinion, started the war, transacted the war. And Woodrow Wilson and Clemenceau would have these afternoons where they would negotiate for hours with one another. And they were both sort of known for not being wilting lilies, right? And they would have, you know, this big spread in front of them, and they would just argue back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for hours. They weren't really making any progress, but Wilson was determined that he was not going to give way until early in April 1919. Anybody remember what happened to Woodrow Wilson in the early days of April 1919?
Strokes.
Well, actually, he had a stroke. He got sick. He got sick, and I think the current theory is he probably caught the Spanish flu.
Oh, yeah.
And he spent a whole week on his back in bed, and he was never ever the same again. He lost a lot of his strength and vigor, and at the end of it, he just gave up. He essentially let Clemenceau write the terms of the, he got his League of Nations in, which ultimately failed. And the US State Department puts it this way: according to French and British wishes, the Treaty of Versailles subjected Germany to strict punitive measures. The treaty required the new German government to surrender approximately 10% of its pre-war territory in Europe and all of its overseas possessions. That placed the harbor city of Danzig in the coal-rich Saarland under the administration of the League of Nations, allowed France to exploit the economic resources of the Saarland until 1935. It limited the German army and navy in size and allowed for the trial of Kaiser Wilhelm II and a number of other high-ranking German officials as war criminals. Under terms of Article 231 of the treaty, the Germans accepted responsibility for the war and the liability to pay financial reparations to the Allies. The Inter-Allied Commission determined the amount and presented its findings in 1921. The amount they determined was 132 billion gold Reichmarks, or 32 billion US dollars, on top of the initial $5 billion payment demanded by the treaty. Germans grew to resent the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Journalist Tad Davis says the Treaty of Versailles, which was so harsh on Germany, pretty much forced them into a depression, humiliated the German people by blaming them for the war, that this treaty would create the foundation for the rise of the Nazis, and obviously everything that followed: the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the deaths of upwards of 80 million people. And it all goes back to the way that the peace of World War I was settled. And having just gone through a global pandemic, it's haunting to me to think that had Wilson not gotten the flu, that whole thing might have ended up differently, and the Holocaust might have been averted, and this whole situation could be different. How something as simple as one person's illness can pivot history in that way. 1919 Treaty of Versailles. That treaty also endorsed the Balfour Declaration. 1922, you get the League of Nations that also confirms those decisions. The Ottoman Empire is gone. Great Britain is given legal authority over what's called British Mandate Palestine. So this area of land becomes a British colony, and they are the governing power there. And then you see on page 21 of this book of the handout a chart that shows Jewish immigration to Palestine between 1918 and 1939. So 1918, the Jewish population is about 60,000. By 1939, it's 460,000. The Arab population, 1918, 688,000. By 1939, a little over 1,070,000, according to that chart. Ongoing immigration was threatening to the larger Arab population. There were Arab attacks on early Jewish settlements in the early 1920s, and Arab riot in Jerusalem in 1929, in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. And in 1936, the Arabs began rioting against the British and the way that they are administrating this land. There's the Peel Commission in 1936. This is a commission set up by the British government to figure out what are we going to do about all the unrest in this area. And there were Jewish representatives who participated. Arab representatives boycotted the commission. The report of the commission indicated there was no solution. They could not see at this time in 1936 any possible solution to the conflict. It recommended that the land of Palestine be partitioned between Jews and Arabs. David Ben-Gurion, who would be the first prime minister of Israel, said the Jews would accept this plan. The Arabs opposed it, and by summer of 1938, the commission had hit a dead end and disbanded. Then Great Britain released a white paper in 1938 that rejected the partition into two nations. This time, the British recommended establishing an Arab state in the Sumerian and Judean highlands and a Jewish state along a stretch of the Mediterranean coast. There's a map of this. Oh, let me see. I think I've got a pretty good map of that partition plan, because this is the one that is eventually shared by the United Nations. Partition plan. I can't get to my tabs. There we go. Oops. Yeah, so this paper in 1938 it essentially remains the same idea that these red areas here or orange areas would be the Arab state, and the blue areas would be the Jewish state, and that Jerusalem itself, because of all the holy sites there, would become an international zone.
Sounds like a plan.
That sounds like a plan, and you can see
It wasn't a plan.
there is attempts to have the properties. That's right. The borders, wrap around one another, but for the most part, there's an attempt to have, some continuity between the various areas.
Also in that agreement.
Well, not in this plan.
Right.
But that evolves later. So now this plan was rejected by the Jewish leadership. They didn't want any part of this. They said it was insufficient land for a Jewish homeland, while Jews were still facing anti-Semitism in Europe. So you have various maps, various plans, different sides saying okay, the other side always saying no. In 1939, of course, the Third Reich, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews are killed, representing about a third of the global Jewish population. And it is sort of universally agreed that this atrocity, once it became known, was sort of the thing that sealed the reality that there was a necessity for a Jewish homeland, that was just absolutely essential. By 1947, the British were tired of being the colonial power governing Palestine. They could not solve the conflicts. They couldn't make anybody happy. They were being criticized. They were facing riots and violence, and so they told the brand new United Nations, "All right, you figure it out. You find a solution." And that map that we just looked at from 1947, that's what they come up with. The British said they would not, they weren't going to implement this plan. They weren't going to enforce the plan. In fact, they're just going to leave. We're just going to pack it up and go home. So in November of 1947, the UN Resolution 181 does this partition of British mandate Palestine into two separate states, an Israeli state and the Palestinian state. On May 14th, 1948, the same day that the British leave, David Ben-Gurion declares that the state of Israel will come into existence at midnight on May 15th. And the United States was the very first nation to recognize the new state of Israel. There was pressure on President Truman not to do so immediately, not until the UN had a chance and to see the formation of both states, but Truman went ahead and recognized Israel immediately, and also pretty much immediately the brand new state of Israel was attacked. 5 Arab nations declared war. So that first map sort of shows the whole region surrounding Palestine. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon all declared war on the new state of Israel. I can say about that, there are many theories about the motivations of each of these countries for attacking when they did. Some of them clearly were motivated out of a desire not to have a Jewish state in their neighborhood, but there was also some hopes that maybe they could just extend their territory a little bit in the midst of this war, add a little bit to what they controlled, and control the size of the new Jewish state. The way that the Israelis tell this story is that 640,000 Jews were victorious in a war over Arab nations that had populations totaling 80 million people. So that's the way that they tell the story, and we'll hear on the other side that a little bit of that is disputable. During that war and even before it, about 700,000 Palestinians lost their homes and became residents of refugee camps in other parts of Palestine and in the nations surrounding the borders of mandate of the partition plan. In the decades that follow, additional wars were fought, as the Israelis put it, because the Arab nations would not accept Israel's existence. And Israel was victorious in these wars and continued laying claim to more land. In 1964, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, was established, and its charter states clear opposition to the state of Israel in 1964. Then in 1967 is the 6 Days War. Israel has an overwhelming victory, takes control of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and it is clear at this point that Israel is the most powerful military power in the Middle East. The lands that the Israeli army conquered on the battlefield were occupied by large populations of Arab people. Nearly 1 million Arabs are now living in occupied territory in 1967. Israel was prepared to concede territory for peace, but they made no definite offer. Arab leaders met in Khartoum and developed a policy of the 3 no's: no peace, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. The PLO at this point forms a terrorist wing of its operation, and we probably all remember remember from history the Jewish Olympic athletes who were held hostage and then murdered at the 1972 Olympic Games. Then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Day of Atonement War, one of Judaism's high holy days. Again, they are attacked. It looks like they're going to lose, but they managed to emerge victorious in that conflict as well. Then in 1977, Anwar Sadat of Egypt indicates a desire for peace, which results in a peace treaty in 1979 between Israel and Egypt, which was signed at the White House under President Jimmy Carter. 1982 to 85, there's war between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Lebanon. So that's in the north, if you look at your map. Then in 1987 is what's called the first Intifada, right? Intifada means a shaking off, this a violent attempt using terrorist methods or guerrilla warfare methods to try to convince Jews to leave. In 1988, Hamas is formed. They reject the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which still has a political wing that is trying to negotiate and work diplomatically, and they call for an all-out holy war to destroy Israel. Talks between the PLO and Israel led to the Oslo Accords in September of 1993, which laid a pathway to a two-state solution and a lasting peace. But in 1995, Prime Minister Rabin, who signed Oslo, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist, and so that the Oslo Accords were not universally accepted on either side of that conflict, which is a pretty good indication that they had compromises on both sides and were a way to a structured, difficult peace that was going to require both sides to give up things that were important. Suicide bombings persist, and by the year 2000, the peace process that had begun really in 1993 just completely stalls out. And we'll look at a frontline documentary about what happened there that I think is very fair to both sides. The second Intifada begins. Operation Defensive Shield sends Israeli forces into the West Bank and Gaza to destroy terrorist networks. The construction of the separation barrier, this 440-mile-long wall that separates formal Israel from the West Bank, begins to be built. Ariel Sharon in 2005 withdraws Israel from Gaza, dismantles Israeli settlements that were there, and allows Gaza to have self-governance. And then in 2006, the Gazans elected Hamas as their government. On page 29 and 30 of the book, there's a long sort of narrative about how the Israelis say that their occupation of these Palestinian territories has benefited the Arabs, essentially saying, that we are the geniuses. We made the desert bloom. You've prospered because we've prospered, and talking about how good everything is there. And then the end of that, let's see, there's a speech from Benjamin Netanyahu to Congress in 2011. So I'll just read that for you. It's on page 30 to 31. Peace would herald a new day for both our peoples, and it could also make the dream of a broader Arab-Israeli peace a realistic possibility. So now here's the question. You've got to ask it. If the benefits of peace with the Palestinians are so clear, why has peace eluded us? Because all 6 Israeli prime ministers since the signing of the Oslo Accords agreed to establish a Palestinian state, myself included. So why has peace not been achieved? Because so far, the Palestinians have been willing to accept a Palestinian state if it meant accepting a Jewish state alongside it. You see, our conflict has never been about the establishment of a Palestinian state. It's always been about the existence of the Jewish state. That is what this conflict is about. In 1947, the UN voted to partition the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews said yes, the Palestinians said no. In recent years, the Palestinians twice refused generous offers by Israeli prime ministers to establish a Palestinian state on virtually all the territory won by Israel in the Six-Day War. They were simply unwilling to end the conflict. That's probably the narrative that we're most familiar with hearing, that the Jews and their leadership have tried and tried and tried to make peace, and that the Arabs are just terrorists and they're not interested in peace. We hear that a lot. So then we turn in the book to what is the Palestinian narrative. This is chapter 2. Lord Shaftesbury, a Christian leader in 19th century England, motivated by a desire to convert Again, to convert Jews to Christianity, believing this would lead to even greater religious conversions, wanted Christians to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which he sloganized as a land without people for a people without a land. And what this reveals is then again, back in the late 19th century, a lot of people just assumed that that Palestine was empty. It was just barren land, just nobody in it, just, you know, would be no issue to just import people there. That wasn't going to bother anybody. In 1891, the Jewish writer Ahad Ha'am visited Palestine and wrote, "We abroad are used to believing the land of Israel is now almost totally desolate, a desert that is not sowed, but in truth that is not the case. Throughout the country, it is difficult to find fields that are not sowed." And in 1905, Yitzhak Epstein, a Palestinian Jew, says, "We have forgotten one small matter. There is in our beloved land an entire nation which has occupied it for hundreds of years and has never thought to leave it." In the video that we watched, the phrase that was thrown around when people went to visit, think about a Jewish homeland there, they came back and reported, "Well, the bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man." Okay, Zionist leaders were aware of this situation. They were aware that there were people settled there, that there were villages, that there was a population of Arabs there, but they did not choose to emphasize this when they talked about Zionism and building a Jewish homeland. When questions were asked, they used the language of transfer. They would simply transfer. This was involuntary exile of Palestinian Arabs from the land that they wanted. Shlomo Ben Ami, the idea of transfer for the Arabs has a long pedigree in Zionist thought. Moral scruples hardly intervened in what was normally seen as a realistic and logical solution, a matter of expediency. And if that language sounds a bit chilling, it's reminiscent of language of the Third Reich to me, right? A final solution, something expedient. The quotes on page 35 in the book of the Palestinian narrative are reliably sourced. And there are many more quotes along the same lines from David Ben-Gurion, often referred to as the George Washington of Israel, that speak about the knowledge that in order to do this, they were going to have to remove people from lands that they had lived on for, in many cases, centuries. That was just going to be a necessary part of creating a Jewish state there. The Balfour Declaration sounds even-handed, but there were serious issues from the beginning. Balfour said in 1919, "Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-old traditions, in present needs and future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." So the declaration was even-handed, but Balfour was not necessarily even-handed in the way he thought that this should be accomplished. In 1915, the British had promised the lands of the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine that they would be recognized, and the British would help to uphold them as independent Arab states in exchange for their support in defeating the Ottoman Empire in World War I. So in order to get them to fight with the Allies, they said, when it's all over, you can have your own states here. In 1916, the British back away from that promise, signaling their intent to divide the lands between themselves and France as areas that they would rule as colonies. So when it was clear the war was going to be won, they backed away from that promise of independence for the Arabs. And so this is to lay the groundwork that when they said that the Balfour Declaration of 1919, the British don't have a lot of credibility with the Arabs, that this would be not harmful to the Arabs who are living in this to be created Jewish state. Ethical issues as well. If a Jewish homeland is necessary because of anti-Semitism in Europe, why is the solution to create the Jewish state outside of Europe? Why were the Arabs in Palestine the ones who would have to pay the price for the anti-Semitism of Europeans? Right? Why here? Why there? Why these people? When you're the ones who have been responsible for the pogroms, for the Holocaust, and that's a question to which there is no good answer other than perhaps religious ones, and that's what we'll turn to in 2 weeks. Secondly, why did Great Britain think it had the right to determine the fate of Palestine? When Balfour issued his declaration, Great Britain had no authority in Palestine. The British did not consult with the Palestinians. They made a unilateral declaration of support for a Jewish homeland. Balfour was a document in which one nation solemnly promises to a second nation the country of a third nation, before they even had political control or authority over the area. In 1948, the UN votes to partition Palestine into 2 separate states. The British withdraw, Israel declares statehood, and Arab nations immediately declare war on the new country. The Israeli narrative says that this brand new nation had to defend itself against 5 invading armies, that there were 640,000 Israelis being threatened by 1.2 million Arabs in Palestine and 80 million Arabs in the surrounding countries. But there's a chart on page 37 that points to the relative troop strength. And so that chart indicates that in mid 1948, Israel had 35,000 troops, and the 5 Arab armies had 28,000. By mid-July, 65,000 Israeli troops, 40,000 Arab troops. That the actual numbers of fighters, and this goes back to what Kathleen was pointing out, that these Arab nations were not necessarily strong, developed, organized nation states, but were relatively new creations, still putting themselves back together after the influence of colonialism and 2 world wars. The Israeli army had superior firepower, more troops, better organized, and most importantly, they had been preparing for war since they began settling the land for decades. The Arab armies were ill-prepared for battle, poorly equipped, and those 5 nations were not necessarily coordinating together their strategy for fighting the war. When the Israelis accepted the UN partition, it was less than they wanted. The Arabs felt it was unjust because it gave way too much away to Israel. And so there's a second chart on that same page that sort of lays out that partition plan. Population prior to the partition, 35% Jewish state, Arab state 65%, land ownership prior to partition, 6.6. Jews own 6.6% of the land prior to the UN partition. Arabs own 87.5%, and land granted under the UN partition plan would have given 57% of the land to the Jews and 43% to the Arabs. So, the greater number of population that had control and ownership of most of the land under that partition plan was going to receive the smaller portion of the land. And when you talk about the land, some of the land there is still fairly undeveloped because it's desert, and so that has to be factored into it. Where the water is, where access to fishing is, all of that goes into, so that's important to keep in mind too. Prior to declaring statehood, there's a document known as Israeli Plan Dalet or Plan D, and these were operations that were carried out. And the plan says these operations can be carried out in the following manner. This is on page 38, either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in their rubble, and especially those population centers that are difficult to control permanently, or by mounting combing and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the villages, conducting searches inside them. In case of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the border of the state. And so there's another map I've given you in the packet that shows about 700 Palestinian villages that have been removed from the map. And in the video, this is talked about pretty explicitly. They said, yeah, you can't even find the names of these villages on maps anymore. We've destroyed the maps. We've removed all the signs that these villages ever existed. We've just erased them from history.
Is the Dead Sea there on that map? Is this the Dead Sea?
I think Somebody help me out. Is the Dead Sea to the north or to the south?
To the south.
To the south. The Sea of Galilee is up north, and the Dead Sea is down here.
Yeah, this
Yes.
is the Dead Sea.
Got it. Okay.
That little tiny thing.
So this is what has been come to be called by the Palestinians the Nakba, or the catastrophe, that that following the pullout of the British, the UN declaration, the creation of the Jewish state, and the war, 700,000 Arab inhabitants became refugees in a matter of months. On May 15th, 1948. So the other thing to note is, and maybe we'll take a break from my run in my mouth, and watch a part of that video for those who weren't able to see it. Let's see.
I
Here
was
we
trying to
are.
figure it out.
This talks a little bit about what's happening in this time period, and the war in 1948, and the way that recent leaders talk about that when they're asked about it. So I'm gonna do this, share, sound, video clip. So share.
When they did that pipeline into the Gaza area, they didn't go into the Red Sea. They went into the Mediterranean Sea, didn't they?
When are you talking about?
They did a pipeline. Israel is in charge of all the water in Gaza.
Yes.
So they had to have had a pipeline. They wouldn't have taken it from the Red Sea. I mean, from the Dead Sea, right?
I don't know the answer to that today. Does anybody have expertise on that? But we'll look into it.
Like they're controlling the water.
Right. Yeah, we talk, he gets into this talking about not only the water, but access to the waters that are fishable, that they say they've withdrawn from the Gaza Strip, but there's a blockade that prevents resources from coming in, produced goods from going out. But let's just look at this. I think it's about 4 minutes long.
Jaffa, just south of Tel Aviv, was in the Arab state in the partition plan. What happened here helps explain why so many Palestinians fled. In April 1948, Arab sniping out of Jaffa was answered by heavy shelling from the Irgun.
The Jews attacked Jaffa, and by bombarding Jaffa, they made the conditions for the Arabs to leave, because the Arabs were afraid that they will be killed. So it wasn't voluntarily, but it was a result of the battle.
But the flight was triggered by more than force.
We let them know in different ways, not in pamphlets, not over the radio, not officially. We let them understand that it's better if they leave because the Jews are terrible. And don't stay here when the Jews come in.
So this was psychological warfare?
In a small scale.
The people flee because of this massacre that happened in Deir Yassin. They were afraid that the same thing will happen here in Jaffa.
Palestinian society was collapsing. Some Israelis claim that the Palestinians were leaving on the orders of Arab leaders to wait for victory. Jewish leaders had discussed moving Arabs out of Palestine for years, but denied that was anything to do with their departure.
Does Israel bear any responsibility for the exodus of Palestinians in 1948?
No.
There are some historians who say that Plan D was a blueprint for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, of Arabs. Is that true?
No. You know, as I say, I was present at the creation. I don't mind what the historians are writing. I watched with their own eyes. Ben-Gurion did not want the Arabs to leave the country.
When we spoke to President Peres of Jerusalem, he said that Israel bears no responsibility whatsoever for the exodus of Palestinians.
No responsibility whatsoever. then what caused the exodus to happen? It was the Israeli massacre of villagers, of people whom they encountered. I can count to you scores of massacres which happened all over the country. Do you think that anybody would leave his home unless he was really threatened?
That's what Perez said to us.
I'm surprised that President Perez has said so.
The 14th of May 1948, the last day of the British Mandate. Britain's legacy to Palestine was a legal system, red pillar boxes, chaos, and war.
Some legacy, right?
Yeah.
So did you, so what did you hear in that little segment?
Well, I took notes on that part.
Yeah.
I watched the video and I enjoyed the video and learned a lot. But when Begin said that the rumor of violence was as effective as actual violence, and then here, psychological warfare, and he says small scale,
Yeah.
is as harmful as real warfare.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so there was this Deir Yassin massacre, which Martin talks about in the book. That happened. A village was massacred by Jewish forces, and that incident that resulted in, I think, 20 or 30 deaths gets picked up and circulated in media throughout the Arab world. And so some of the thought is, well, yeah, they picked it up and in some ways were overblown about what happened, made it all seem worse than it was in order to try to build support and outrage for the Palestinian cause in Palestine. But it also had the effect of making the remaining Arab populations in Palestine very frightened about what might happen. And that, as you heard there, somebody who worked in one of the Jewish militias saying, and we took advantage of that, and we made it known that yes, we were awful, we were horrible, and you don't want to be here when we get here. And so there was a mass fleeing from these cities and villages to places that were presumed to be safe. And then the Israeli narrative, as he said, is that, well, no, there were other Arab leaders just telling the people, get out, flee. That way, when we come through and win, we won't have to worry. We'll know that everybody there is Jewish and we can just kill them all, and it'll make fighting the war easier. There's not really any records of those sort of pronouncements being made. That seems to be a narrative that's been sort of created or at least exaggerated. But the main point is that during this war in 1948 and even before, when some of these massacres were happening, and again, here you have Shimon Peres, who was president when this video was made, saying, no, we have no responsibility. We didn't do anything to make them leave and flee. We didn't create a single refugee. We never wanted it to happen. And you turn to an Arab leader who is just incredulous at how could you even say that? You have no responsibility. I'm shocked. So that inability to even agree on even some sort of shared responsibility for the creation of all these refugees. We've been here a little over an hour. We're not going to get to chapter 3 at all for those who haven't read it, but what's important to point out in all of this is once those refugees fled those villages, the ones that had not already been destroyed and assimilated, the war's over, and most of those refugees then try to come back, partly under the framework of Balfour, right, which promised that there would be no change in legal status for the non-Jewish residents of Palestine. They seek to return to their homes, and they are turned away. The Jewish do not allow any of those refugees to come back. And that is a policy that remains in place to the present. All of those refugees who left in 1948 or those who fled during the war in 1967 for safety have been denied the right to return to their homes. So only if you remained and stayed there and survived the war do you have even rights as a second-class citizen within Israel.
Yeah, their citizenship is not the same as what we consider citizenship in the United States.
And that status, that right of the refusal of the right of refugees to return after war, is in direct contradiction of UN Resolution 194. Right, the United Nations has stated that refugees from war, and then following that, Israel, with the lands that were conquered in 1948 and then in 1967, beyond what was partitioned under the UN partition plan. They have occupied those since 1948 to 1967, respectively, and they have continued to settle Jews in those lands, to destroy existing Arab villages and to build new destroy Palestinian villages and build new Jewish communities there, to build roads and infrastructure, to essentially by leaving the Palestinian village off the map and declaring it not an official village. They do not provide electricity, schools, postal service, any kind of government services to the people who still live there. They're denied access to the roads that are built to support the Jewish settlement. And all of this is in contradiction to UN resolutions as well, and the Geneva Conventions, which state that when you occupy territory in war, you should not deport the people who live there or import other people into the land, that it's a temporary occupation until the time of hostility is ceased, but you don't try to move the people there out, ethnically cleanse areas. So Israel, this modern political state of Israel, has a tendency to, when the UN gives them something, right, they take it. When the UN asks of them something, they generally just refuse and ignore it. So that's and there are some long citations in this, some experiences of what it's like to live under, particularly in chapter 3, for Palestinians who live under the current Jewish occupation, what checkpoints are like, the inability to access. You may own farmland, but the Jews can, the Jewish state, the military can deny you ability to go and access your land. If you don't actively cultivate your land because they've blocked your access to it, then they declare that the land is not being as productive as it should be, and that you're an absentee farmer, and they'll confiscate the land, and that all of this is ongoing and continuing. So is that, for those of you who didn't have a chance to read or access, is that a narrative that you've heard a lot about? Is that a side of the story that you're familiar with?
No.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. And so I like the way that some of the quotes at the very end of the reading go, that they make and part of why chapter 3 is important, and we'll return to it when we meet again, is that it tries to address the fact of terrorism and groups like Hamas and the PLO, and their resorting to violence. And what Pastor Martin discovered in that is that the violence of the Jewish state against the Palestinians is everyday and small by comparison. It is, if you want to go visit your cousin, you have to go through a checkpoint, which means you have to strip down to your underwear, and you may have to try and find 3 or 4 different routes to get there to find a checkpoint that's going to be, it's that kind of humiliation and the threat of violence if you lose your temper, if you get angry, if you lose your patience at what's going on, if you get too frustrated. But none of that makes the news. But rocket fire from Gaza into a Jewish settlement is going to make the news. And that Condoleezza Rice has said the prolonged experience of deprivation and humiliation can radicalize even normal people. And one thing that became clear to Frederick Martin as he explored this is that there have been atrocities committed by both sides. right? There have been acts of aggression and warfare on both sides. There have been over promises made by European colonial powers that they could not keep, that were not done in any way in negotiation or in partnership with the people who already lived there, and that the collapse of the peace process is shameful, but well, we'll look at that again. Just that there's been atrocities on both sides, but we don't tend to get exposed to them in the same way. And that if we're going to be at all even-handed in this, we have to try to listen to both sides and understand that the security of the state of Israel can't come at the ongoing deprivation, humiliation, and inability of the Palestinians to prosper and thrive in their own state. And that the creation of an Arab state can't come at the cost of, again, more violence and an inability for Jews to live in peace and security. And so both sides have we have to move past this place where we're talking past each other and not even being able to acknowledge some realities of history if we're going to have any hope of putting this together. But that it's not been helpful when we don't have an understanding of what it's like to live as a Palestinian in the West Bank or in Gaza. And they're treated differently at this point. But still in the West Bank, if the Jewish government decides that they want to clear some land for some reason and your house is there as a Palestinian, they'll give you 24 hours notice and they will show up with a bulldozer and they'll just bulldoze your house and you have no legal recourse.
They don't even have to give you your slip to let you know that if it's on your land, if they put a piece of paper on your land telling you that they're going to come in 24 hours and you don't see that piece of paper, they will still go and bulldoze your thing.
Yeah,
Your land.
It's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I think your point is well taken when you say that we only hear one side of this. You know, I was like 110% pro-Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
And now I had a little glimmer of that though when Caitlin introduced me to Ahmed Hamdi. He's an Egyptian Muslim from Cairo, and he got his master's degree here at Texas State. He's an engineer. And his job, which he accepted, and I think because not a lot of people would want to do this job, he was going from city to city on different projects. It was perfect for him. So he spent time in San Francisco, Boston, Texas, all over the country. He's been here about 2.5 years now, I would say. But anyway, he was the one that told us that you only hear one side, and he told us a little bit. This is one point where he is unwavering and he will not bend. But there was a second point that is not related to this, but this Egyptian slant, and that is the gay straight issue. And he was unwavering on that until he worked in San Francisco.
Okay.
And he said, Caitlin, the gay men who were in San Francisco working on my project were so kind, so nice, so helpful. I thought, whoa, you know, a little bit of Vaseline in there.
Yes,
So
yes.
we'll see, maybe, yeah. So he also said that after living here for a couple of years now, 2.5 years, I said, would you go back to Egypt? He said, I would go back frequently to visit my family. I would never live there after living in America. You have no idea how blessed you are. So he's really, I wish he could be here because he would be perfect for this, but very interesting and very bright guy.
There's a email address in the back of the book to connect with the author. And so I have sent him a note just thanking him for taking the time to do this and to present things that we did. And if he does ever, sit down and chat with groups, we'd love to get on his schedule to have a conversation and be able to ask questions of him. So I haven't heard back yet, but if I do, I'll let you know. So lingering questions, observations, Kathleen, you look like you're ready to chime in.
I thought, and I don't know if Lynn had this experience. One of the things we have to realize is that Israel has a much better PR system. And one of the things they did in the 70s into the 80s is they sent Jewish teenagers, high school kids, to synagogues. And then those synagogues arranged for those students to go to all the schools in the area. You got a note from the synagogue that said, would you like a free assembly? Would you like your students like to meet with the students from another country? Well, there isn't a teacher in the world who's not going to say, wow, I could sit back and, somebody else could do it. And they would do these fascinating presentations. It got to be the same after a while. I heard that for a number of years. But what was fascinating was the pictures that they would show, the depictions of the Palestinians were, this is how the Arabs are living. And it was a guy with a camel. And nobody had a cell phone, nobody was modern, everybody was backward, and every picture of every Jew was modern and up to date, and so psychologically, here you have a group of, they were going into elementary schools, they were going into high schools, junior high schools, middle schools, and two teenagers talking about life, and this is the music that we like, and we're wearing blue jeans, and we're just like you. Very powerful, but it's only one side. And so I'm glad, because some of I had the experience with people that I know experiencing the other side, and so I knew there was another side. But I'm glad that we're working on this, to understand that there's two sides to this story. It's not easy.
I'm amazed that Israel is talking about how it's a democracy, and yet the people who live, the Palestinians, they have absolutely no rights. They can be rounded up and held in jail for ever, I guess, if
6 months at a time.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, they have no rights. They have no, and Netanyahu, I think, if this is my opinion, you all don't have to agree with me, but I think he's a dictator, and I don't think he ever plans to give up power.
So we're gonna watch a frontline documentary on down the road here about the collapse of the peace process, and one of the things that became clear to me, and that was made some years ago, and but they made it re-available on PBS's website, is that Netanyahu was, some of the other Israeli prime ministers along the line on the peace process were serious about trying to achieve a peace. Netanyahu was not. He was really talking out of both sides of his mouth, and did some pretty provocative things to stop, to provoke the other side into violent response that would halt the peace process along the way.
One person that has spoken out in is Bashir Tlaib, Palestinian House of Representatives, representative from Michigan.
Yes.
And she has attempted to, and her message has been soundly negatively portrayed.
Yes.
Yeah, the House even censured her.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's the Palestinian cause has not been popular, and this was really kind of trying to lay a foundation about some history and how both sides interpret, and what parts of it they lift up and what parts of it they prefer not to talk about it. As I put all my cards on the table, I'm going to be this presbytery's commissioner to the General Assembly next summer. And I know that at that General Assembly, the Presbyterian Church USA is going to consider making another statement about this process. And I knew right away, I didn't know enough to really know how to participate in those conversations. So part of this is me getting ready for General Assembly, because the knowledge is in recent years, the Presbyterian Church has done a few things that have led the Anti-Defamation League to label the PCUSA as an anti-Semitic organization, which has been very painful to a lot of us who kind of know the people who sit around Presbyterian tables and try to do things decently and in order, and who don't hate Jews, but who have real questions when we start exploring the history and the circumstances on the ground. And so one of the things the Presbyterian Church did about a decade ago now was we voted to pull all of our investments, and we have the Presbyterian Church through its foundation and the Board of Pensions, the pension fund for its ministers, we have around $8 billion in invested resources. And we divested those resources from Caterpillar and Motorola were the two big companies. And we did that because when the Jewish army goes to demolish Palestinian homes, they do it using tractors built by Caterpillar. And the checkpoints that the Palestinians have to pass through that are used to control the Palestinian population, whether they can move from one neighborhood to another, a lot of that technology was provided by Motorola. And so we try to use our investments to convince those companies to stop selling equipment to the Israeli army, and they were not willing to do that. And so it was the discernment of the General Assembly back then that it violated our principles to make money off of companies that were making money off of this conflict. But that was the first time that we were labeled as being anti-Semitic and not supportive of Israel. And more recently, we have passed overtures and statements that have used the term apartheid state because of the knowledge that even Arab citizens of Israel don't enjoy the same rights as Jewish citizens. And in this book, you may want to read that part again, where it talks about a Jewish state and this language that Benjamin Netanyahu uses all the time, that, well, the Palestinians simply won't accept a Jewish state. And that sounds like a very benign thing, but what it really means is a state where the Arabs who live there have to accept permanently status as second-class citizens. And that no Palestinian is going to embrace that notion, not just a political state of Israel, but a political state that enshrines a two-tiered system of citizenship.
May I say, this is John.
Hi, John.
One of the things I've noticed over the years, the Jewish, I don't know how to say it, but they are very quick in any situation to jump into the political arena strongly at the very beginning and to try to avoid any conversation about what caused the situation. They have the control of the media so much that if you criticize or question like we're doing, they would immediately brand any person in this room as a anti-Semite, and they do it very strongly. And I don't know how we answer that, because when they come on where you can't even state your opinion, and if you do state or a question, you're anti-Semite, and they brand you. They brand people constantly in the public and in the whole of public arena. So if a conversation about what's going on there is immediately branded anti-Semite, it makes, of course, it makes conversation impossible.
It does, yes.
I was in Israel a few years ago, and I saw the actions on the settlements and that, and they were very honest about that. The guy told us that they get a settlement, they go take the Arab land without compunction. Like you said, if there's a man's house there, they just bulldoze it, build a settlement. So the Palestinians, even in their parts that we say are Palestinian areas, have no control over their own destiny.
Thanks,
No.
Thanks.
I think it's interesting that a nation that was perpetrated upon can now perpetrate upon others. It's that, what have we learned? So it is eye-opening having these discussions.
One of the reasons given
for this current war is that Netanyahu wants to have complete control of the government. And he was more interested in that than listening to the possibility of Hamas coming in and killing a number of people because of that. I support Israel, but they need a new government.
So Netanyahu has not been helpful. Ariel Sharon was not really helpful in advancing the cause of peace either. And at this point, I think it seems pretty much the entire political infrastructure of the modern state of Israel is moving in one direction in support of settlements, increasing settlements, and control of the land. And that there's a fair amount of evidence that this has been a long-range plan to look like, well, we want peace and we're willing to make concessions, but to make the concessions in ways that sound reasonable, particularly people who don't know the other side and are disconnected from the history. Something like 75 to 80% of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, still live within 100 kilometers from their homelands that was taken in 1948 and 1967. That most of them have not spread out because they have believed that there would be at some point an end to this conflict and a right to return. But the right to return is one of the things that Israel never puts up on the table for negotiation. All right. 90 minutes is probably about the length of people's bladder tolerance and attention span. So what I want to prove for is if you haven't had a chance to read through all this material, if you haven't had a chance to get it, I can make hard copies if you couldn't download it. And again, with that video link, I would just say, if you go to the video, it's right here, link to documentary. If you follow that link, it should take you here, and all you have to do is click play. So, and that should prevent you from being asked to pay for anything or whatever else. It's intended to be free. So, and I guess you found it on YouTube. So you can go to YouTube and look for The Birth of Israel, and try to find it there as well.
And it had that author too. There was a whole.
Talked about.
So I hope on Monday, if not before, I'm going to send you a Bible study to do on your own time. And that's what we're going to discuss when we come back. We're going to look at the promise in Genesis, right? That if you go where I send you to Abraham, right, I will give you these things. And we're gonna.
I was waiting for God to come into the part here.
Yes, we're going to read that, and we're going to read though passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy that talk about what it means to be God's chosen people, and how living in that covenant is connected to the land. We're going to read about the experience of the Jewish exile under the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and some New Testament statements about the connection between Christianity. I'm going to put all this out here. It's going to be a fair amount of Bible reading, and ask you to sort of look at it, think about it, pray about it, discern what it's saying to you, and then we're going to have much more conversation in 2 weeks about what we read and saw and how we think about some of the theological claims that are out there. And then 2 weeks from that, we're going to look at what I consider to be the Wild West of theology, from somebody who's part of a staid tradition of confession and reads prophecy in one way. We're going to look at the way some other churches talk about biblical prophecy and are really motivated by it. and how that has fueled involvement of Christians in the prolonging of this conflict. So that's where we're headed. So look for that Bible study. Have fun engaging with both Old and New Testament texts. Have some conversations together as I email them out. Feel free to go ahead and raise some questions on email back and forth if you want, things that stand out or observations that you have. And mainly just thanks for your time and your willingness to engage with all of this today in this place that I hope is safe while all this is happening in the news. Go in peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to read more chapters in the book?
No, but no.
I don't have it.
So all you can, if you haven't finished reading this stuff, then you can keep doing that. But all you have to do for next time is the Bible study, which I'll send out on Monday.
And a date of that, please, Billy?
I think it's
2 weeks from today.
29th.
Yep, 2 weeks from today at 11 o'clock.
Okay. Yeah, something like that.
Absolutely.
Got it, Alice? Yeah. Okay.